For all the helpful suggestions and encouragement, I am truly grateful. Their ideas are wonderful. At 72, the catastrophe did not commence. Everything delicate in Sharon Osbourne's life disappeared in a single terrible, irreparable moment when she was only 6 years old. She came into this world in 1952 into an ostentatiously powerful family in London, one owned by the notorious and infamous music magnate, Don Arden. Cold weather, though as internal stone. Slammed doors, yelled commands, and restrictions that felt like laws etched into concrete replaced lullabies and bedtime embraces. Power and contracts were the foundation of her father's world. Feelings weren't included in the original plan. The bit that haunted her, though, was this. A tragic automobile accident claimed Sharon's mother's life when she was a tiny kid. She would cling to a few small sources of solace one day, and then there would be complete quiet the next, remained a permanent resident. Without a mother figure, she would have no one to lean on in times of need or protect her from her father's harsh treatment. That kind of death does more than make people sad. It permanently alters a person's perspective on trust, safety, and love. When Sharon's mother passed away and her father became mired in his job and ego, she was forced to mature rapidly. Even though there were a lot of high-profile guests and lucrative transactions, the house felt emotionally devoid. She saw merciless executives vying for control of the industry as poor artists struggled just to stay afloat. Neither dolls nor fairy tales were part of her playtime. She became adept at reading social cues, spotting impending danger, and concealing her emotions from others around her. What transpired thereafter further resoluted her. She had more than simply melancholy. By the time she reached her teenage years in the late 1960s, she also had strategy. She had no interest in being the bride-to-be. She had been the girl who studied her father's domineering presence in every room, committed power dynamics to memory, and practiced comebacks. They didn't communicate for years after their relationship broke down. Something else, though, was taking shape despite the agony. Nothing broke Sharon. It honed her skills. She wore her trauma like a shield. A lot of individuals don't get what she learned until much later in life, but it didn't help her at the time life. That solace is delicate. That love can vanish in the blink of an eye. Furthermore, there will be occasions when you must rely solely on your determination to stay alive. And the tale truly starts there. An empire, a myth, and a family that was quietly crumbling would one day be held together only by that tenacity. Sharon Osbourne's career in music had already taken off by the time she was in her late 20s, but she did not rely on the reputation of her father. Crawling through it on her own terms, she was teetering on the brink of complete collapse. Opposite Osbourne followed. The year was 1977. Ozzy was recently expelled from Black Sabbath. She was deemed a has-been, engulfed in drugs, and her downward spiral was rapid. Toxic was his name. Supposedly that was the end of his career. He was trembling, blurry, and crushed. Still, Sharon failed to perceive a disintegrated guy. The giant's wounded form reflected the anguish and instability she had experienced in her own life. Everything shifted after that choice. She was more than simply his manager. Completely she picked him. She lost everything because of that decision. Her fury burst forth in her father. Ozzy was an embarrassment and an unnecessary risk in his eyes. Their relationship fell apart because Sharon would not budge. She had been severed, disowned. It was as if the wealth, security, and inheritance vanished into thin air. She, however, did not blink. In hindsight, she did confess that she had lost relatives. But I discovered love. It lacked poetry. Blood splattered everywhere. Despite widespread scorn, Sharon staked her future on a man. The hazards were not lost on her. It would be their downfall together if he was unsuccessful. However, she opted for an unprotected sort of love, and those first few years were the worst. Australian was hardly able to function. The medication was consistent. The funds were disappearing. Sharon prayed he would make it through the night, as she negotiated contracts during the day. For the sake of survival, she put her whole emotional and financial life on the line. Next to her motel bed on several evenings were stacks of overdue bills. On other occasions, she would sit alone and wonder whether Ozzy would go to the next round of the show. She persisted, though, under no circumstances. And even as Ossie hobbled off stage and muttered, "Don't let them see me like this," Sharon would clean his face, straighten his jacket, and catch him if he fell. She sobbed quietly in the hotel restrooms during her alone time. To the untrained eye, she appeared unmoved, and all the way through her creation, which caught everyone off guard. He was more than simply a career manager to her. It was being revived by her. Tours were organized by her. She changed the image's branding. The record labels began to have faith in her again. When she did tie the knot with him in 1982, it was anything but a fairy tale. This solemn promise was penned in the spirit of war, weariness, selflessness, and rebellion, because saving Ossie's life wasn't the only thing Sharon did. She restored his name and work. She accomplished all this while bearing the burden of her own family's death, navigating the disorder caused by her husband's addiction, and witnessing his struggles with his own demons on a nightly basis. Conflict continued far into the 1980s. They made a commotion both on stage and off stage. In the midst of Ozzy Osbourne's meteoric rise to stardom, with albums like Bark at the Moon and Blizzard of Oz, Sharon was managing her household, her career, and damage control. Now she was a manager for one of rock's most erratic performers, and a mother of 3. To her surprise, though, her strategy had no precedence. At one point she was lulling a sleeping infant to slumber. Suddenly she was guiding Ozzy through withdrawals to help her relax. Afterwards, she proceeded to negotiate tour contracts over the phone. It was relentless. Contrarily, this is what the majority of individuals failed to see. In the shadows, life went on. Everyone could hear the tunes. The sold-out crowds were visible to them. Yet Sharon witnessed overdoses that were narrowly averted. Whispering ambulances, treatment plans buried in stage notes, and piles of invoices threatening to topple over the applause. The same was true for Ozzy. In retrospect, he said, "She saved my life when I couldn't even look at myself." This was years after the fact. Sharon was doing more than just overseeing a brand. Piece by piece, she was reassembling a man. And somehow, through it all, she managed to keep her children from getting swept up in the mayhem, at least for a little while. Next year, 1996 began. Sharon was instrumental in launching Ozfest, the heavy metal music festival that would come to define a whole generation. Stages and crowds were magically bestowed upon bands that were previously unbookable. It was accomplished by Sharon. She wasn't seeking compliments when she was ruthless and clever. With each show, she was able to construct a foundation for her future. Regardless, the cost was exorbitant. She was in a precarious marital position. Her well-being was deteriorating. Even with all she was carrying, there were evenings when she couldn't sleep. At times Ozzy would stutter and squawk as she stumbled down the platform, urging not to let them witness my tumble. Sharon would swoop in and rescue him, every single time, and then quietly disappear into the hotel room to cry it out. The machine's backbone, she was the commanding force behind the mayhem. Allegedly manipulative, cold, and domineering, she was widely despised. Even though the woman was awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, they failed to notice her. In seeing through emergencies as her spouse battled in order to master his own thoughts and body, they failed to notice the manner in which she shielded him, both verbally and physically. She was the one who subtly reassembled everything when it had fallen apart. Because Sharon never wavered in her belief, no matter what, that the family would be safe if she maintained her strength. That if she snapped, the whole system would collapse. Therefore she remained unbroken. Outside of the public eye, never in front of her children, never mind when she should have crumbled under the weight. Sharon Osbourne had already dominated the music industry at the turn of the millennium. Reality television, though, was going to introduce her to an even more disorderly environment, and with it a storm for which she and her loved ones were unprepared. A reality show featuring the Osbourne family debuted in 2002. Fans thought it was funny. It posed a threat to Sharon. They were followed by cameras at all times. The children getting into mischief, Ozzy muttering as he makes his way around the home, and Sharon shrieking like a queen of controlled insanity from room to room. Funny, unfiltered, and yet endearing, that was it. However, once the cameras started rolling, there was no turning back. so it was a real emotional battleground behind the scenes. Personal experiences were made public. Tensions at home escalated into ratings for television. After dedicating her life to preventing the collapse of her home, Sharon found herself unexpectedly forced to observe its unfolding on television in front of millions of viewers. The strain mounted as the stardom skyrocketed. Nonetheless, Sharon assumed command. She transcended her role as Aussie's spouse. She achieved superstar status. She became famous overnight for her biting honesty, unflinching devotion, and quick wit. She made her way from the wings to the spotlight, publication of books, appearances in interviews, sponsorships, and finally, a judging position on X Factor UK and America's Got Talent. Fire engulfed her. The events occurring behind closed doors were not, however, erased by this success. Sharon had a terrible secret she was keeping from everyone while they laughed at the Osbournes. Colon cancer had been identified. Cancer, in contrast to the spotlights, was beyond her control. Her strength was tested. It was taxing on her muscles, plus it almost killed her, but she persisted nevertheless. She entered settings as if nothing was wrong, donning wigs and fake grins. But she was sick from chemotherapy before she ever sat down in the makeup chair, whispering to herself, "Just hold on." She sat on the floor of her restroom before taking her seat at the judge's table. She carried it out. Her children, Aussie, and the brand she had worked so hard to build all kept her going. Growing up afraid, alone, and never knowing when mom would return was something she never wanted her children to experience. As a result, she battled not only cancer but also the anxiety that being apart from her loved ones would reopen the wounds she'd felt since she was a little girl. This was not renown. We were surviving, even though everyone else was staring at Sharon. She was secretly fighting her hardest struggle with cancer, while yet holding her family close. Slowly but surely. She was unique because of that. The fortitude required to confront illness, disappointment, and a media circus, rather than the limelight or triumph. Even so, persist. Sharon Osbourne was battling more than just cancer. As her own body was deteriorating from chemotherapy, her family was falling apart in ways she couldn't turn a blind eye to or stop. Jack, her son, was descending into substance abuse. Kelly, her daughter, who was once full of life, was now a drunk and addicted. This wasn't merely a mother showing strength, it was a mother showing desperation. With a phone in one hand and an IV line in the other, Sharon's veins were swollen, her skin pale, and her strength dwindling as she spent her nights frantically calling rehab centers, her hair falling out from chemotherapy, and her inability to walk unaided. Aussie was involved in a near-fatal ATV accident in December 2003, while Sharon was still in the middle of her treatment. He suffered broken ribs, a broken collarbone, and severe bruises to his chest, but he continued to push through the pain. Although cancer may take her body slowly, addiction was tearing her children apart even faster. It needed to take a breath for him. Sharon, dragging herself through the hospital halls while hooked up to her IV, positioned herself at his bedside like a soldier in battle. "You're not leaving me," she whispered, her weak lips quivering with weakness. Half-conscious and broken, Aussie would later confess that she saved her own life by holding Sharon's hand in one room and making calls regarding Jack's rehabilitation in another. The hits continued though. Horrified by the world's laughter at the Osbourne, which they mistook for comedy, Sharon would later weep silently as she watched Kelly struggle with her own dependency. These moments went unnoticed and unfilmed, but they occurred repeatedly. Sharon was experiencing the end of the world as her family crumbled around her. Even when she was sick with chemotherapy and curled up on the floor of the restroom between takes, she refused to let anyone see her give up. Likewise, when she sat awake at night, whispering, "Not now," she refused to let anyone see her collapse. At this time, no, she stayed when she should have walked away because if she were to fall, who would be left to keep them all together? Behind closed doors, Sharon was the last line of defense. She was the one who was willing to burn herself out to keep her family breathing. After surviving cancer, near bankruptcy, and watching her kids spiral into chaos, Sharon Osbourne did what she always did. She got back up, and this time it seemed like the worst was behind her. That was both her curse and her power. To everyone else, she was a reality star, a manager, and a media icon. As a result of her fiery, honest, and sharp personality, Sharon became a household name by 2010. Her voice stood out on The X Factor, America's Got Talent, and the talk show circuit, and she earned respect from viewers and judges alike for not sugarcoating or holding back her candid emotions. Sharon defended a friend in a moment that spiraled fast in 2021 during a heated exchange on The Talk. The show tried to move on, but the damage was done. Overnight, she went from fan favorite to public enemy. And this time, the backlash wasn't just loud, it was relentless. She told the truth even when it hurt, but the truth would cost her everything. Claims flooded social media, headlines portrayed her as toxic, contracts fell through, and friends disappeared. Sharon, who had battled addiction, betrayal, cancer, and financial ruin, found herself unexpectedly caught in a war she hadn't anticipated. An unseen storm of public anger sent her spiraling, though not dramatically. She read the news alone, sobbed in private, and then confessed in an interview that she had thought my life was over, not referring to her job, but herself. Her health began to deteriorate, and she began to sleep less frequently. Nevertheless, she did what she usually does, she got back up and kept going. Without pleading for pity or penning an open letter, she simply stated, "You can live in shame, or you can live in truth." She exited the stage with a sense of defiance rather than defeat. Truth, not opinion, would destroy Sharon, scandal wouldn't stop her, and neither would cancer. Instead, Sharon chose to openly discuss her regrets, the pain of being misunderstood, and the ease with which strength can be confused for cruelty. This was because Sharon Osbourne was never flawless. She refused to fade away, remaining visible, present, and most importantly, herself, even after the show ended and the headlines faded. That might have been the most powerful thing she ever did. She was simply honest, and in a world where honesty can be a liability, she paid the full price. Despite overcoming cancer and managing Aussie, Sharon Osbourne also had to overcome a world that sought to erase her and prove that you don't need everyone's love to know your worth. Then, just when she thought she had weathered the worst, life dealt her an even more personal blow, Aussie's betrayal. After decades of loyalty, rebuilding his career, and carrying him through addiction, illness and collapse, she found out he had been unfaithful, and it wasn't a simile. It was true, Aussie acknowledged it. Sharon described the realization as a stab to the heart. She had given her all for him, as his nurse, his manager, his wife, and his protector, and now the man she had rescued so many times was the one who hurt her the most. She finally broke away, leaving the man she had sacrificed so much for. House abandoned their lives. Aussie lingered behind, taken aback. The enveloping stillness was deafening. Sharon reflected afterwards that it seemed as though all they had worked for came crashing down in an instant. Of all the fires they had weathered together, this one nearly reduced her to dust. However, the narrative did not conclude with that, for what followed was not a dissolution of their marriage. The decision to stay was not based on weakness, but on a desire to rebuild, not without conditions, but with therapy, accountability, and the truth. Forgiveness was not given, but earned. Then, the darkest night of her life came. One evening, while spiraling into illness, addiction, and emotional collapse, Aussie lost control. Even her closest friends were shocked by Sharon's decision to stay, which she made, not because it was easy, but because she refused to let trauma win. That night, she described as the moment she truly believed she might not survive, her vision going black, her breath shortening, the police called, and sirens screamed through the night. Suddenly, the man she had spent decades protecting became someone she didn't recognize. "If we can heal this, we can heal anything," she declared. Aussie didn't try to conceal his mistakes, he addressed them publicly. Sharon didn't sugarcoat it either. Forgiveness, she said, wasn't about forgetting, it was about survival.
And so began the long, painful path of therapy, apologies, and genuine, honest talks. You don't have to run, but you do have to demand change, she advised other victims of betrayal after she addressed her suffering head-on, rather than trying to downplay it. This wasn't about outward appearances, rather it was about the inner fortitude that Sharon shown in that period of her life. Strength doesn't always mean walking away, sometimes strength is staying and setting a boundary no one can cross again. Healing is a process. She forgave Ossie not to restore his reputation, but to save their family, their children, and herself. That night would not define them, instead, it was a turning point. She transformed her heartbreak into testimony, a message to those who suffer alone: you can rebuild. In 2019, Ossie Osbourne had aged considerably. A fall at home and a series of seemingly minor accidents had left him fragile, stitched together with metal rods, and unable to walk without collapsing. Sharon remained by his side throughout it all. She wasn't there to help him heal, but the truth had to be revealed first. No longer simply his wife, she took on the role of caretaker, nurse, and advocate for him. She educated herself on medical terminology, learned to interpret heart monitors, and sat in waiting rooms with her head buried in her hands as doctors explained what was going wrong next. When his legs wouldn't work, she helped him into bed. When he shivered at night, she wrapped him in blankets. What made it even more brutal was that Ossie could feel himself vanishing. He once engulfed arenas in flames, but now he gasps for breath just walking across the room. These past few years have been nothing but hell, he told interviewers. The man Sharon had helped recover from addiction was now seeing him systematically decimated, and Sharon was witnessing it all. He wasn't being dramatic, he was being honest. Age, pain, and a body that wouldn't comply no longer didn't deter her. She stood firm, refusing to whine or worry. Instead, she took his hand and declared, "We fight this together or not at all." However, nothing could have prepared her for the subsequent events. In January of 2020, Ossie stood before the cameras and delivered the statements that devastated people all over the globe. "I have Parkinson's." His speech faltered, and his hands quivered. Sitting silently by his side, Sharon placed her steady, solid hand on top of his, refusing to let the world perceive him as weak. At that moment, Sharon no longer shielded him from the world, she proudly protected his legacy in public. She spoke for him when he couldn't handle. She reassured fans, corrected reporters, and made it clear that Ossie Osbourne may be sick, but he is not finished. Then the pandemic hit. Both Sharon and Ossie tested positive for COVID-19. Their immune systems were already weakened. The nights were long, the symptoms were terrifying. Sharon would later admit that what scared her the most wasn't dying. Ossie would occasionally open his eyes and murmur, "If she goes, I go too," as she dragged herself across the room to make sure he was still breathing, and the notion of them both passing away and leaving their children alone was a terrible thought. That was no poetry, it was pure terror. Somehow they prevailed, they lived. However, the price was high. Ossie's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Sharon sensed that their time together was running out. Although she couldn't turn back the hands of time, she could grant him one final wish, a memorable performance in Birmingham, the city where it all started for Ossie Osbourne, before the final moments of silence. But for Sharon, it was a different story, a meticulously planned farewell. Ossie had pleaded with her not to let him pass away quietly. He did not want his legacy to end in a press release or a hospital bed. Rather, he wanted to go out performing for an adoring audience, no matter the cost. So Sharon proceeded with caution, like a general getting ready for battle. Ossie needed this, and Sharon made it happen. As the lights went down and the music started, Ossie stepped forward, frail and slow but determined. She oversaw the doctors, the logistics, the security, and the emotional weight of it all. She didn't tell fans this was the last one, but she knew, she always knew. The risk of his spine giving out mid-on, and the danger of collapse rested on her shoulders. He remained authoritative, his voice quivering but rising. This was more than a concert, it was a rebellion. A man was dedicating his very being to the people who had supported him for decades. Sharon sat in the wings, whispering a prayer with each note, pleading with him to finish. Just give him a chance to finish. A member of the staff later said that it wasn't a performance, but a sacred rite. The audience gave out cries of wonder and grief, as if to signal the conclusion. With the last chord struck, Ossie bowed, and the arena went boom, but it wasn't due to applause. For Ossie, this wasn't just an end, it was her ending as well. She had built that stage, not only with contracts and strategy, but with pain, loyalty, and a love that most people can't understand. It was a quiet, broken, and beautiful tribute to a man who had given them everything. And behind the curtain, Sharon finally let her tears fall, quiet, broken, and full of grace. She had carried him through addiction, surgeries, Parkinson's, and now this. On July 22, 2025, a few weeks after his last concert, Ossie's breathing slowed. The man who had once screamed across stadiums was now barely whispering. Sharon remained by his side the entire time. There were no cameras, no press, just her hand in his. It was an experience that people never have. As the lights dimmed, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The end came quietly. "You screamed till the end, my darling. Rest now," she whispered, and just like that, he was gone. Sharon remained calm. She didn't let out a scream or collapse. Instead, she pressed her forehead on his, and remained there, immobilized in that last moment of silence. 10 years of turmoil, conflict, and loudness had finally come to an end. It was not a farewell, but a coronation in reverse. Thousands waited in line, wearing black shirts with Ossie's face printed on them, candles flickering among the mourners. But the silence would never be peace, it would be loss, the deepest kind. No matter how many storms Sharon had weathered, this was the one she couldn't fix, the one she couldn't carry. The music he had played before resounded like a eulogy through the stone walls of the church. Sharon Osbourne stood alone at the front, her hand on the casket, her face invisible to the cameras, but visible to those closest to her. Her eyes lingered on the wood, as if she were pleading for it to open one last time. She whispered that he wanted to depart noisily, and he did, but then the crowd outside burst into a final chant, "Ossie, Ossie." What followed was much worse. The crowds dissipated, and the cameras departed. Standing smack in the midst of it all, Sharon let her tears to fall without apologizing. Her king had departed. Sharon remained in Buckinghamshire, the home she and Ossie had shared for years. Their children, Jack, Kelly, and Amy, visited often, bringing their grandchildren to fill the space with laughter. The condolences ceased, and for the first time in decades, she was truly alone. There was no tour to plan, no show to run, no hospital call to take, just silence, and there was a side of the bed that would never be filled again. But now the laughter resounded differently, and she still has trouble sleeping some nights. At dawn she wanders through the garden, past the flowers that Ossie used to love, and murmurs to herself, as if he were still listening from his favorite location. She also eats healthily, while she maintains a facade. The silent and relentless grief follows her everywhere. She continues to work, but at a slower pace. When she finds the strength, she oversees the Osborne podcast. When she has a chance, she checks in on the biopic project. She oversees the estate, which is now estimated to be worth over $200 million. However, everything moves at her own pace now. Grief has altered her rhythm. Instead of viewing Ossie's final concert, every single pound, as a mere performance, Sharon transformed it into a covenant of hope. It was not a goodbye but a gift. Even in her grief, she continues to protect him. Sharon rarely attends public events, but when she does, her speeches are concise and impactful. Sharon knows she can't erase the pain, but she also knows this: she carried him through life. Now she must keep the echo alive, she says, because love didn't die with Ossie, it lives in their children, in the causes they support, and in the silence she endures. Sharon Osbourne has maintained a low profile since Ossie Osbourne's death in July 2025. She manages to appear composed in public while visibly changing for those who have known her longest. She has lost weight, and her face has taken on a new stillness. Her friends have noticed that her eyes appear distant, as if she's always halfway lost in memory. The pain isn't loud, but it's palpable.